Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's a Not-So-Super Wednesday, March 4th, 2020. Your humble host is a little bummed out by the results of Super Tuesday, and so he has declared a ski day tomorrow, which will double as a mental health day. There's a little fresh powder up in the mountains. During February, we got absolutely no precipitation, so this may be my last chance this season. And at the risk of being muted by YouTube, I want to begin the podcast today with a little musical lift from Green Day.
Don't wanna be an American idiot. Don't want a nation under the new media. Hey, can you hear the sound of hysteria? The subliminal mindfuck America.
Yes, the subliminal mindfuck of the corporate media colluding with the leaders of the Democratic Party. The gatekeepers declared Bernie too dangerous, too risky, and in a remarkable Lemming effect, in less than 72 hours, hordes of Democrats coast to coast, north and mostly in the south, decided to repeat 2004, where they rejected the fiery Howard Dean because he had screamed, and went with the safe bet of John Kerry. And you remember President Kerry and the Kerry administration? I'm afraid, friends, that's where we are headed. Now, the good news is that Bernie is not finished, and that the scourge, or the non-surge of Mike Bloomfield, and that the scourge of billionaire boss Bloomberg has been eliminated after he announced this morning that he is ending his campaign to buy the presidency of the United States. So it is truly a mixed bag, and we're going to break it down for you during today's podcast. But the place where I want to start is on 60 Minutes, a week ago Sunday, when Anderson Cooper laid an ambush for Bernie Sanders and asked him about, were you too cozy with Castro, too nice to him? That fed into the debate on Tuesday night, where Sanders was hammered from every side for being an apologist for a communist government. And once again, the moderators of these debates skillfully steered us away from any significant current foreign policy issues, like our regime change wars, the American military footprint, Trump's desire to start a war with Iran. None of that was important because Bernie had to be tagged as a redster, a fellow traveler of commies. And I thought he dealt with it fairly well. But the media was relentless. And it led into all of these claims about electability. And what occurred to me last night as I was watching the coverage of the election returns is that Americans have been sports-centered. And it's all about trying to pick the winner. And so the presidential primaries are more of a sweepstakes, where people are trying to get on board and predict who's going to win so they can say, yeah, I voted for Biden. And we no longer vote our principles and select the candidate who best matches our views and our aspirations. No, we're all caught up in this horse race mentality. And in the exit polling, the most common comment was, well, Biden, I don't think he's that great, but everybody says he can win, and so I'm just going to climb on board. Yesterday, I raised the question whether this parade of lemmings will be led right off a cliff by Joe Biden, with his sunny disposition, his frequent gaffes that people are kind enough to overlook, and the incredible bad baggage that he carries from his political career. Now, one of the big disappointments is that we've been kind of waiting for Godot. If you know that Beckett play, I don't think Godot ever did show up, did he? I fell asleep in the second act. But we have been waiting for the boomers and the Gen Z voters to turn out in mass numbers. And when they vote substantially for Bernie, huge percentages. But the extra turnout has not been realized. And when you combine it with the fraidy cat boomers who think that, they've got their Medicare, so Medicare for all doesn't matter. They even are a little weak on ending college debt. Yeah, the learned helplessness, as I call it. It's not my phrase, but that's what I use to describe the attitude of so many Democratic voters. They become accustomed to being filled with fear and making votes to attempt to reach safety instead of embracing bold change. So in Virginia, more than 1.3 million voters cast ballots compared to roughly 800,000 4 years ago. That's a great jump in turnout. But the percentage of young voters participating declined. In Alabama, only 10% of the voters were 17 to 29 compared with 14% in 2016. And Sanders won 60% of those voters compared to 46% in 2016. Smaller pool, higher share. In North Carolina, 14% of Tuesday's electorate were young voters compared to 16% 4 years ago. And there's a bit of a flip from Alabama because 57% went for Sanders this year compared to 69% 4 years ago. In Tennessee, 11% of voters showed up Tuesday, the young voters, versus 15% in 2016. And the numbers for Virginia, young voters 13% of Tuesday's vote compared to 16% in 2016. And I'm very disappointed by that. And I, like others, have been arguing that Sanders widens the electorate, brings in young voters. The demographics show that there's been not a huge, but almost a doubling of those who are in that age group and have the potential to vote. And I don't know if it's just the total malaise that Trump leaves people feeling helpless and hopeless, and that young people just check out, play some video games, hang out with their friends, go skateboarding. And so we end up with a situation here where Sanders has lost the lead in the delegates. It's not huge, but as you look at the map going forward, Sanders has a good chance for a catch-up next week, and then it's a long run to the convention. So billionaire boss Bloomberg decided that after spending $500 million, and in some states, for example in Minnesota, he picked up 8% of the vote, but it cost him $220 per vote. And in Tennessee, the only place where he actually cleared 15% and picked up a few delegates, he spent $8 million, got 80,000 votes. That's $100 a vote. Now, it is encouraging that there are limits to what money can buy you. And Trump showed that the illusion of wealth, he didn't really spend that much of his own money in 2016, was enough to, in some ways, attract people who think that a wealthy businessman will manage the government well. And yet Trump didn't burn through $500 million of his own money. So Mike says that he entered the race to defeat Donald Trump, and today he's leaving the race to defeat Donald Trump. But it became clear that Bloomberg's goal was to block Bernie Sanders. And when he saw the party rank and file follow the orders dictated by the party leadership, they fell in line. Bernie is now, he appears safe to those establishment Democrats. And so Mike Bloomberg will return to spend more time with his fortune. And I couldn't be more gratified that he has left the race so soon. Now we look at Elizabeth Warren. Very disappointing night for her, and I feel for her supporters. I don't have a lot of animus toward Elizabeth Warren. I'm disappointed in the way she turned on Sanders starting during the week of the Iowa debate. But I was thrilled when she went for the jugular in the debates and killed the candidacy of Mike Bloomberg. And today she is assessing the path forward, which doesn't seem like it offers much. And so I think we can expect her to bow out in the next few days. But I am not encouraging Warren to leave. I want her to make that decision on her own terms. I do think it'll benefit Sanders to have the clear choice of these two old white male career politicians who have very different platforms. And at The Guardian today, they had a report how Elizabeth Warren destroyed Mike Bloomberg's campaign in 60 seconds. And her opener in the debate in Las Vegas was stunning. And at the time, you may recall, I cited some writers at The Intercept who had said, yeah, there's a political assassination there. That Warren successfully decapitated the billionaire. But they said, will it be seen long-term as a murder-suicide? And I'm afraid that's what it turned out to be. I think that her attacks on both Sanders and Bloomberg cost her. Now, Jennifer Rubin, reliable moderate at the Washington Post, in her column today asked why Elizabeth Warren never caught on. Now, she did catch on last fall. She was showing very strongly in some places, outpacing Bernie Sanders. And Rubin writes, Warren had a policy plan for everything. She had a compelling, overarching message. She was a tactically brilliant debater. She had grassroots enthusiasm and organization. So why has she lost every single primary and failed to live up to that potential? Now, Rubin immediately goes for sexism. And I recognize that any female candidate will face a sexist American voting public. But I think particularly in the Democratic Party, that we're over most of the identity politics. While there were some gay Americans who were drawn to Pete Buttigieg simply because of his sexual orientation, most people considered that to be just an attribute. And they supported him for his bland, centrist calls for unification. And likewise, I think at this point, most Americans do not make a choice for president, first and foremost based on gender. But Rubin argues one explanation is that voters were so cowed by Clinton's loss in 2016 and so convinced that her gender accounted for the loss. I don't believe that's the case. I don't think she lost because she was a woman. She was a bad candidate, ran a bad campaign, and had some bad breaks from self-inflicted wounds, starting with her private email server. But Rubin is convinced that ingrained sexism, reinforced by media storylines about electability, might be more difficult to root out than we imagine when the race started with 6 female candidates. Well, you can tell I don't agree with her take. Then she says, another explanation, Warren was not a good strategic politician. She admits she wasn't born a politician, rather born a fighter. She committed a series of tactical blunders, the DNA test, clinging to Medicare for all, and then struggling to defend it. Well, my view is that she backed away from it, and voters saw that as a weakness. Refusing to go after Sanders in the debates. Now, there were times when she chose to attack other people, but she did not spare Bernie Sanders, and that is a myth that is promoted in much of the commentariat. Then Rubin tries this. Another explanation might be that she suffered from the same malady that afflicted Buttigieg. She could not attract non-white voters. I believe overall that Warren was strong until she played the sexism card against Sanders in Iowa. And that turned into a kind of victim mentality that I think many people run away from, including many women. So take that, Jennifer Rubin. Then there's Matt Flegenheimer at the New York Times. Democrats decide that Joe Biden, as risky as he ever was, is the safest bet. And I think Flegenheimer does a good job of teasing out the irony. That Joe Biden, who has a hard time getting a sentence out completely, he stumbles, he gaffes, he misstates things, and yet people rush to support him despite the obvious evidence of his weaknesses in that regard. A bad debater, and is it Flegenheimer? What is his name? Yeah, Flegenheimer writes, any suggestion that Biden is now a risk-free option would appear to contradict the available evidence. He's no safer with a microphone, no likelier to complete a thought without exaggeration or bewildering detour. He has not, as a 77-year-old man proudly set in his ways, acquired new powers of persuasion or management in the 72 hours since his first primary state victory of his 3 presidential campaigns. That's right. That's the only one he had ever won. And the media just, stampedes the herd. It was incredible. When it mattered most, though, Flegenheimer says, the judgment came swiftly from Sanders-averse Democrats. Yes, the Bernie phobes who said, all right, we'll take him. He goes on to say, certainly Trump would appear to have had his preferences. Last year, he was impeached after trying to enlist a foreign power's help to damage Biden. In recent weeks, he has tweeted mischievous praise of Sanders. But what if Trump is wrong? What if every elected official hustling to endorse Biden after long resisting is wrong too? Recent election history, especially Trump's, has been unkind to conventional wisdom. Well, I give Mr. Flegenheimer high marks for his analysis. Then there's Nate Cohn crunching the numbers. And it is a bit reassuring that, we don't have the full outcome in California. And next week's primaries will probably be wrapped up before we have a definitive result here. There are just too many people who voted at the last minute and did it by mail. And so you're going to have to be patient. But at this point, about 50 delegates separate Biden from Sanders. And so it is not mathematically impossible for Sanders to catch up. But Sanders would have benefited from a big wave of victories last night, and that was not in the cards. And Cohn writes, the Super Tuesday results do not augur well for Sanders' odds of pulling it off. He remained so competitive on Super Tuesday in part because of the large number of early and absentee voters who cast ballots before it became apparent that Biden was being cast as the viable moderate candidate. If you want a little pep talk and you're a Sanders supporter, I've linked to an article by Eric Levitz at New York Magazine. Headline, Bernie Sanders is still in a remarkably strong position. And he says that despite the clear setbacks last night, Sanders' present position is disappointing for the left, but viewed against any broader backdrop, it's exhilarating, he said. If you had told the Sanders campaign a year ago that Bernie would emerge from the first 4 primary contests with a delegate lead have an even shot of preserving his front-runner status, and have as his chief rival a version of Joe Biden so compromised by the ravages of time. He says next week's debate could further reset the campaign because it's going to be 2 or 3 people on that stage. And he argues this is not a case for complacency. Sanders remains in a remarkably strong position for a Democratic socialist in an American presidential campaign. Now, with the polling shift of the last 2 days, Biden appears to have the upper hand. The Sanders campaign would be wise to reflect on how this happened. It's possible there was nothing that the Vermont senator could do to prevent this coalescence. But to presume that would be to embrace defeatism. And he closes, perhaps Tuesday's results will validate Sanders' insurgent strategy as a wave of disaffected first-time voters drown out Biden's recent gains. Well, where are those first-time voters? I'm calling out first-time voters in Washington and Idaho, Michigan and North Dakota, Missouri, and even in Mississippi. Those are the states that hold their primaries next Tuesday. So let me just recap it for you. Joe Biden won late at night in Texas. Early in they declared him the winner in Alabama moments after the polls closed. He won Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Maine, Minnesota, and Oklahoma. And the ones that really surprised me were Maine. I know enough progressives there that I thought Sanders would eke out the win. It was neck and neck through the evening. And in Minnesota, a lot of people must have held back their votes and listened to Amy Klobuchar, because Sanders was showing up in the polls there and was poised to do very well in Minnesota. So in the Sanders column, Vermont, Utah, Colorado, that's a nice one, and California, where he currently leads Biden 48 to 27%. My guess is that as these late-mailed absentee ballots are counted, many of them will go for Biden. So it's possible that Bernie has reached his peak vote count in California, but I don't know that. So Biden's victories were powered by Democratic voters who went his day just days before casting their ballots in a wave of late momentum. And it was largely driven by African Americans. Plus, it's notable that in some states, the late deciders made up roughly half of all voters. That is pretty rare. And I continue to be amazed that people could watch all these debates, follow the campaign. Now, many, I guess, just didn't. They just look at headlines or, posts on Facebook without clicking through to read them. But I'm amazed that so many people were undecided the night before the election, some of them even on the day of the election. Richard Wolff is often wrong. He's a moderate Democrat, used to be a regular on MSNBC. But he has a good point today. He said there's a precedent for what we're witnessing. The last nominee to come back from the dead like this was John Kerry. Back in 2004, Democrats were on fire for another progressive Vermont firebrand, Howard Dean. But after the scream, the contest flipped on its head. Kerry won in Iowa. Within 2 months, he had sewn up the whole thing. The description at the time was the Democrats had dated Dean, but they married Kerry. And this is the same big blunder I see being repeated here in 2020. Democrats simply don't learn. They are afraid of change. They're afraid of challenging their own corporate donors. And somehow they believe in the myth of the center, the moderate middle. And they're leading us down the same ugly path again. So last night in Los Angeles, Joe Biden took the stage for his victory speech. And first, there was a little confusion because his wife Jill and his sister Valerie were on stage with him. And he says, well, they changed places, but he initially introduced Valerie as Jill and Jill as Valerie and then had to straighten that out. And moments later, Jill Biden intercepted a rush from the other side of the field. The stage was stormed by a group of protesters who want dairy to die. And that's an extreme wing of climate change activists. And, they do have an argument. Dairy cows, they pump out a lot of methane. At any rate, Jill Biden intercepted one of those protesters before she could get right to Joe. And, the kerfuffle lasted a few seconds. There were problems with the election process yesterday in Texas, in Austin, and several other cities. It took hours for people to vote. As of 1 a.m. Eastern Time, some polls were still open in Texas, but they couldn't say how many. We also had long lines in Los Angeles where people were waiting to vote as late as 10 p.m. The polls closed at 8. And their new ballot marking devices, there were concerns about touchscreen machines and the coronavirus problem. And we'll wait for the forensics to see if there were any serious elements of fraud or other issues related to this election process. For our progressive friends, many people were following the entry of Cenk Uygur into electoral politics. He was running in the open primary to replace Katie Hill. That's north of Los Angeles. He came in fourth with just 5% of the vote. Jeff Sessions, well, he wanted to win the nomination, but he will face a runoff with the former Auburn football coach Tommy Tuberville. Hard to know who to bet on in that race. And the efforts of the Democratic establishment to fend off a meaningful challenge of one of the conservatives, Henry Cuellar in Texas, led to Cuellar winning. This is a guy who votes with Trump nearly 70% of the time. And Jessica Cisneros, a former 26-year-old former, she's an immigration attorney who was a former intern in Cuellar's office. So the progressives didn't do so well there. But Shahid Buttar here in San Francisco, who's challenging Nancy Pelosi, he cleared the primary, made the top two with only 13% of the vote. That's a little disappointing. And Shahid is a great guy. I've known him for many years. I'll set up an interview with him before November and see if he has a better chance of winning against Pelosi in the fall. And there is one success story for one of the candidates who's been endorsed by Justice Democrats, and that is Georgette Gomez, who is the president of the San Diego City Council. She did come in second to a Democrat who is funded by her grandfather's fortune, and that's from the Qualcomm family. Her name is Jacob. Her first Jacobs, Sarah Jacobs. And her granddaddy has put $1.5 million into a super PAC that is funding her campaign. And despite that, she has some pretty progressive positions. She supports Medicare for all and a Green New Deal, a $15 minimum wage. And she is the choice of the party establishment. So I'm interested to see how Georgette Gomez does in the finals in November. I have some comments from listeners here. One of the first came in from Lamara Williams-Jones. I don't even have words for my disgust today. I'm older, but believe we need a big change away from so-called liberals like Obama and Biden. We need someone who will really fight for the people, especially the younger generation. Yesterday proved the establishment does not give a damn about any of it. You are right, they're willing to blow it all up on a flawed candidate. Then Paul Leto sent me a note. And by the way, he lives near Kirkland, Washington, which is one of the epicenters of the coronavirus so far. He said, according to exit polls, the strongest Biden voting bloc were people concerned about coronavirus. Then he went on to say, notice that what's left in the Democratic field is two older white guys. This winnowing is mostly due to two competing concepts of electability. Biden argues electability based on reaching out to Republican ideas in his political resume, while Bernie points to many polls showing him beating Trump by the most. That said, various other Dems beat Trump, but by less than Bernie. But the focus on electability imports a lot of racism, sexism, homophobia, and progressive phobia into the analysis because voters project onto the electorate by thinking what other people might be thinking. I think that's a really good point. He also goes on to say that electability concepts not based on actual polls cause many Democrats to vote for the farthest thing from the anti-discrimination society they want to create. Then there's Stephen Zunis, professor of politics at the University of San Francisco, who posted this on Facebook. He wrote, "Warning, I am among the large number of Democrats and Democratic-leaning voters who will not vote for the Democratic nominee if it's Joe Biden. Back in 2002, along with other Mideast experts, I told every Democratic and moderate Republican senator we thought we could convince that Iraq was not a threat. Biden, among a number of others, apparently didn't care. I also told every Democratic senator who at that point had refused to commit to voting no, despite our providing them with that information, that if they went ahead and supported war authorization anyway, that I would never under any circumstances vote for them. I also promised a man who lost his only son in the initial invasion that I would never vote for someone who contributed to his death. I'm saying this now because in case Biden is the nominee, I don't want you all to start getting hysterical this fall over my refusal to vote for him and insist that I break my promises. I will not." And there is strong sentiment. And even though the turnout among younger voters is not what Sanders had hoped for, Biden won't get support from almost all of those young voters. He is just that far out of touch. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Julie Anders, thank you for renewing your annual subscription. Carl Howard is good for $5 a month every damn month. We've got Jerry in Southeast Portland and Siri Walgren in far North California. Thank you each and every one for your support. And if you'd like to support my work, just visit peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on the Become a Subscriber button, and you'll land on the sign-up page. Today I'm posting an interview for my subscribers that appeared at Who, What, Why a couple of weeks ago as part of Black History Month. It's my interview with photo editor Rich Cahan, and his powerful new book, which is called River of Blood, really touched me. It's these fascinating photos of African Americans who lived under slavery and survived, and their verbatim testimonials that are really touching. Here's an excerpt from that conversation with Rich Cahan.
I think one of the problems with our education is that we learn about slavery in kind of political terms. You know, we talk about Dred Scott, we talk about the North and the South. We learn about it in kind of economic terms. They talk about the cotton looms and how the North took the cotton, and they depended on that too. And somehow the humanity, the single humanity, human story seems to get lost. I think that's the greatest value of this collection.
You can hear the full interview with Richard Cahan. It's available for subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. Today, the Supreme Court heard, two sessions of oral arguments, one related to Louisiana's obviously unconstitutional and pretextual abortion law, and the discussions revolved around whether you need to have hospital admitting privileges if you're an abortion doctor. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg was there to argue that most people who have complications, and they're typically minor, are already at home, and they don't go back to the abortion clinic if they need follow-up health care. So there are other arguments being presented, but Chief Justice John Roberts is the new Anthony Kennedy. And he is personally opposed to abortion rights. We know that. But he voted against a similar law back in 2016. And so there's a lot of speculation about what he might do. The justices also heard arguments about whether the president has the right to fire the head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Now, this was the brainchild, is that right? this was the product of Elizabeth Warren and the work that she did to set this up. And the law was written by Congress saying that the president could only fire the director of the CFPB for cause. And Trump fired, what was his name? Richard, he ran for governor in Ohio, and he fired him without cause. Lawsuit was brought, now before the Supreme Court, and they're arguing over whether the language, I guess, meets other standards. But we'll see how that one plays out when the decisions are announced in June. The Inspector General of the Justice Department is slamming the FBI for failing to address identified weaknesses in how it deals with so-called homegrown terrorists. Now, when we get into the language of calling people terrorists, I get very uncomfortable, and particularly when they are Americans operating in the United States. And I see the probability here of a kind of creep where we treat people accused as terrorists differently from ordinary lawbreakers. And I don't think that the distinction is generally helpful. But in any case, the Inspector General, Michael Horowitz, says that the Bureau seems to recognize its failings but doesn't fix the problems. And separately, 10 members, Democrats of the House of Representatives, are calling on the State Department to create a list of white supremacist groups and call them foreign terrorist organizations. Now, this relates to a group of neo-Nazi operators, and some of them are offshore. Some of them have an American presence with links to foreign organizations of similar ilk. For example, Combat 18 is a group that has been banned in Canada and Germany. And we've talked about Atomwaffen Division, a neo-Nazi group who the leader was arrested in Texas last week. And it's A.C. Thompson, the talented reporter who has gone undercover for Frontline to investigate Atomwaffen. But again, my issue is, why do you have to have a special label for criminal activity? It only allows what I consider to be improper application of the law. I've often felt uncomfortable about Human Rights Watch. Nominally, their mission is to expose human rights violations across the globe. And Ken Roth, whom I've interviewed and found to be wanting, has now admitted that he erred when he accepted a nearly $500,000 donation from a Saudi billionaire shortly after Human Rights Watch had published reports about documented labor abuses at one of the man's companies. And the accusation is that he exploits non-Saudi labor in the Great Kingdom. Now, this is a huge blunder. Human Rights Watch has admitted that. They deeply regret the decision. Stood in stark contrast to our core values. Ken Roth takes responsibility. And they say they have returned the money. Kudos to The Intercept for exposing and putting pressure on Ken Roth. This is the first chance I've had to comment on last weekend's announcement that there is a peace deal in Afghanistan. It's not holding, and it's based on a framework that cannot survive because the United States made a peace deal with the Taliban. The Taliban refuses to deal with the Afghan government of Ghani, and so our efforts to force the issue were based on just a reduction in violence by the Taliban. But according to a bit of research by the New York Times, at least 66 people have been killed since last Saturday during the period of lowered violence. And finally today on the coronavirus, Italy, where now 107 people have been reported killed. That's an increase of 28 in just a day. They have announced the ordering of closure of all schools and universities for the foreseeable future. And in Austin, Texas, the promoters of South by Southwest, which is a great music and film event that I've attended a couple of times, they say that the event will go on despite concerns about exposure to the coronavirus. And finally, Linda Lewis, who is a listener, a supporter, a retired whistleblower from FEMA. She is happy to report that Robert Kadlec has finally been authorized to run the response to the coronavirus, and it's because it's his job. And she said that the White House is basically finally coming around to dealing with the existing management structure. She also sent a copy of a report where a person who had been summoned to the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta was locked out of the building. And apparently they wouldn't honor his government pass. And I don't know exactly what that's all about, but it's weird. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. I'll be back on Friday, and I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.